Hello, I am Sinner, and I am back with another book review, but this time it's going to be a little different. I haven't done one of these unscripted book reviews in a while, and I've been still absorbing that information. So I'm going to do three in one this time round. I'm going to review just off the cusp, off the top of my head, three books. We're going to do Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. Democracy, the God That Failed by Hans-Hermann Hoppe, and um, Neema Parvini's The Populist Delusion. I don't know why it took me so long to remember that. Anyway, I'm going to start with The Populist Delusion, which was actually kind of a letdown, low key. I don't know why, but this was a book that in my head I had the assumption that it was like a lot more what would you say, a lot more thorough and like uh to be honest, longer. I mean, it's like only 100 pages long, a lot more thorough, longer, and a lot more proofs and what would you say? Like really hardcore arguments, not hardcore arguments, but really strong arguments being made. Whereas the book is really just a short overview of a body of literature. That's what the book is. The book covers other people's ideas and doesn't expand on them in any meaningful way. Now, as an introductory book into elite theory, I think it's pretty good, but that's sort of not how the internet um, made me think it was going to be. I was on the assumption that this book would be like really interesting and or a lot more interesting than it was. I still think it's a really interesting book, but I thought it would be like an ideological, very thorough breakdown of um the pop like politics and such. Now that being said, I think it was good. I think it made some really cool insights, and I think what it did as a book, which is something that's like really hard to describe, is when you have an idea in your head, but you don't really know how to articulate it, and then someone else articulates it for you. And then you're like, oh, I've been thinking that the whole time. The whole time I was thinking that. That's sort of how I felt with this book. Um, Sort of about like the managerial revolution by James Burnham, which he talks about. And I'm going to buy that book now. Definitely going to buy that book. I'm going to read James Burnham. And some of the other stuff with Carl Schmitt and um, Pareto and Mosca, Iron Rule of Oligarchy, and a lot of these sort of ideas about economics, human behavior, and power. And I think, to be honest, although I don't really know much about it, it's very short. I think it does give a very good baseline for, or a very good framework rather, for understanding a lot of human behavior and a lot of cultural change, as well as our society more broadly. I think if, especially if you look at how money influences most Western governments, it really is fair to say that we don't elect the leaders, rather the leaders get themselves elected with the help of their rich friends. And it's really kind of like a more plutocratic system, more oligarchical system with a managerial upper class. Um, Sort of kind of similar to what what's his face? That JD Vance guy. Mencius Moldbug. I forget his name. Mencius Moldbug. That guy. He was talking about the cathedral. Similar idea. But yeah, I don't really have too much to say on it. It was a good book. It was very short. Overall, I think it has a lot of explanatory power, worth reading. Overhyped, however. I think it's still a very good book, but I was let down because of how high my expectations were. All right, so next we'll move on to Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes. This book was another book that I went into it expecting something completely different. I went into this book expecting that I would be reading something more akin to liberty and equality, but like from a different perspective, in the sense that it has a clear thesis about politics and it's making an argument that monarchy is good. Because I know it's a piece of monarchist literature, Leviathan. And I thought it was going to be like this argument about why democracy bad, absolute monarchy good, which is really not what it was about. It's basically a book about legal theory and what law is and what counts as law, and um, mainly what it's about is a thing called the covenant, I guess is what I would label it as. But it's sort of like a proto-social contract where he argues in this book, Hobbes argues that by being a member of society, you're sort of consenting to the rules of society, and therefore you're obligated to follow the rules, and everyone else is also obligated to follow the rules because, like, we're all working together, and then once you break the rules, you break the covenant, like, and then because you break the covenant, the rules, like, don't apply to you. But the whole argument is basically around why you need to use force to maintain a peaceful society. That's the main argument. It's about why enforcing your will as a king is important. And I think there's some things that I like about it in terms of that. I don't really like the whole social contract thing. Like it's called a covenant, but like I kind of get it, but I just disagree with the idea that just because I'm participating in society, I'm somehow consenting to all the rules of society. I think that's sort of a bit incorrect. And to parrot from like the elite theorists, which I've literally just learnt about recently, society is both consensual and non-consensual in a sort of similar way to being a member of a family is. So I think that's probably a more accurate way to look at society and being a member of it as both consensual and non-consensual. One thing though about Leviathan, which I will say, which I was really, really impressed by, and I think is something that I respect a lot, is that the book goes to great lengths to justify its beliefs, which is something that you don't really see a lot of the time. Like, he starts off the book talking about like nominalism and sort of critiquing scholasticism, and I don't fully agree with his positions. He basically, and he talks about like epistemology essentially, and words being something that relates to reality and yada yada yada. And then he goes on to talk about human nature, and then from human nature he then goes on to talk about the law, and then that's what the rest of the book is about. It's about the law. But because he's done such a thorough job explaining his presuppositions and his foundations, it means that the conclusions come very naturally. And you don't really have to you don't have to think too hard about like where he's coming from. It all comes across as very straightforward and logical and internally consistent. And I really respect that. I think one of the things that really frustrates me about modern politics is no one is really explaining their presuppositions. No one goes around explaining the underlying logic of their own beliefs. But Hobbes does that, and he does a really good job at that. And for that reason, very good book. And I think as well, it's while I disagreed with it, I think it was a good book to read because you have to have answers to like why rules in society exist. You have to be able to come up with an answer. And his answer is a very good one. It's, well, you need rules so that way society can exist. Everyone needs to agree or be made to agree in order to have a conducive society. And there's a little bit of a contradiction there because like he on the one hand, because of his low view of his, and it's a Protestant view, I kind of agree with it, but the view that like humans are sort of sinners and violent and low key a little evil, like because humans are like that, you need force in order to enforce society. But on the other hand, he's also saying like that by just simply being a member of society, by participating in society, you're consenting to the rules of society, which is like a bit of a contradiction. But yeah, I think he makes overall like a lot of really clear, good points. And I think in some ways he actually makes good arguments for monarchy, though they're coming from a very different place to what I would necessarily like align, if that makes sense. Like essentially the arguments are comparative to democracy, and he sort of parrots some of the things Aristotle says about like there only being, oligarchy slash aristocracy, um, or oligarchy, monarchy, and democracy. Basically, single rule, small rule, majority rule. That's all those three definitions really mean. I agree with that. Agree with Aristotle on that. But yeah. Anyway, I think I've talked enough about that book. Overall, another good book. Don't really disagree. I don't really agree, sorry. I agree more with what I read in um, the Italian elite theory stuff, though I kind of did disagree with some of the beliefs about human nature that some of those thinkers had. But yeah, in general, Hobbes, very good book, worth reading. Finally, the last book will be Democracy, the God That Failed by Hans-Hermann Hoppe. First ANCAP book I've ever read. What are my thoughts? I kind of had the assumption that it would be better than Liberty or Equality, and I kind of think that's wrong. I do like the book. I think it makes some good points at some points, but it makes some bad points at others. I think the main flaw with Democracy, the God That Failed, is it assumes that everything that is non-consensual is bad and everything that's consensual is good. And for that reason, like, government and statism is bad because you don't consent to being taxed and all this sort of stuff. And it's like, sure, but on some level, you just have to accept the fact that in society, some things you will consent to and some things you won't consent to. It's too moralistic, is how I would describe it. And it kind of, this whole like idea that you can have like everything be consensual and that'll just fix all your problems is kind of weird to me. It comes across as naive because no society is realistically going to work that way. There is, frankly, an element of Darwinism, and that's something that I'm sort of suspicious about with free trade, because free trade, yeah, it is a lot of the time economically beneficial, but the negative side effect is you become reliant on other people, and those other people may or may not undermine you for your against your own interests, okay? So in a perfectly moral society, yeah, free trade would be great. In like a perfectly moral world, it's probably a better thing to say. But we don't live in like a perfectly moral world. And therefore, having things like, oh, well, everyone should just, like, there shouldn't be a government, everything should be free trade. These sorts of things I disagree with. I think that's too naive, too unrealistic. Um, if it were plausible, I don't think it's necessarily like that bad of an idea. Um, the other thing is about this book is I do agree with a lot of the things he says. I think that he does a really good job in that book of showing that, hey, democracy has actually made society materially worse. Now, this is a revisionist position, but he does a very good job of showing how taxes have gone up, public spending has gone up, national debt has gone up, basically proving that, hey, the government can't really spend the money well, and it can't use its position in the best way possible. And in that way, it sort of does echo some of the things that are said in Liberty and Equality about like incentive structures and sort of you having more personal liberty and freedom in medieval times, or like a pre as like Hoppe must hate Woodrow Wilson. That's I get that view from this book. But yeah, overall, I think it was pretty good. I kind of disagree with some of that ANCAP stuff. I think it's eh, but he makes good points when he's criticizing democracy. I think that like um a lot of his presuppositions are a bit too moralistic and unrealistic. That being said, good book. I like the book. Um, and yeah, there we go. I think that's all I have to say. 3 books, 1 review. Um, yeah, they're all good. I've got some. I'm still reading. I'm still reading. There's gonna be some other stuff, but yeah. Anyway, I am Sinner. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.